Thank you, Shamika. First of all, a little disclosure. I mean, I'm not really an expert in these matters and haven't really thought about them very much. I actually agreed to come and comment mainly because I wanted to learn what is the conventional wisdom in a very important area. So I want to sort of respond, with a few slightly disconnected comments. After, of course, saying to Bertrand that I really enjoyed, I can't say the actual chapter, I mean, I have got it, but, the presentation, it collects a huge amount of information. And, I think one of the things that the Bretton Woods institutions do very well is to familiarize people with what the global kind of situation looks like. And that's not easy to get. And for that, I compliment you. Now, let me make a few comments. They don't alter my basic point. That's a very, very interesting thing. But I'm going to focus. I mean, I have to disagree with you. There's no value add if I were to simply say, this is a wonderful paper and couldn't have been better. So take my comments from that point of view. And they're a little disconnected. First, I want to put in what I think is a teeny bit of a protest, not against you, but I'm a little concerned that the domestic development debate is getting hijacked and reclothed in whatever is the current fashion out in the West. And I think this whole push on inequality is a good example of that, because if you were to really look at the Indian problem, I think, at least to the extent to which I could think about it, the Indian problem is that, look, they say the government, any government, is conning us into the belief that, thank God, we are lifting a lot more people above the poverty line than was done earlier. I mean, we know that in the 10-year period from 2004 to 2011, not 7 years, huge numbers of people went above the poverty line. Immediately there was a debate in India saying, what is this nonsensical poverty line? So, I was in government then, and I said, look, you cannot defend the poverty line abstractly, and you can certainly say that we want to have a higher poverty line. But even if you do that, there's still a hell of a lot of people went above it. We hardly begin to savor, I wouldn't call it an achievement, but certainly a positive development, when all of a sudden the debate shifts and the argument is, hang on a minute, this is not interesting at all, because it's the increase in inequality that's interesting. And along comes one of our most distinguished economists in the world, Thomas Piketty, who apparently has convinced everybody except Surjit Bhalla, and I'll leave him to, that India is not only, is more unequal than it was in 1920. When the whole bloody country was owned by either the British or a bunch of old feudal people, and that inequality has been steadily increasing, and especially during the liberalization period. A sort of a harking back to the happy days before liberalization, when whatever else was wrong, at least we weren't unequal. Now, in my view, this is complete nonsense. This has nothing to do with your paper, but I'm just saying that, if you were to, I'm not saying, by the way, that we should be praising the previous government or the present government or whatever. But if you're suddenly getting a new debate, then I think we need to know, why is the old debate over? I mean, is it really the case that those problems have gone and that these are really the new problems? I don't think they are. Second, I mean, the entire debate on manufacturing is also driven by a presumption in the US, I think, mainly, that, the US has suffered because of the hollowing out of manufacturing, which, as others have said, is attributed to trade taking away our jobs. Now, the truth is that, I wish the World Economic Outlook had spent more time drawing the attention to the most influential countries in the world, that there are some contradictions here. I mean, the United States is today, I think, has the lowest unemployment rate since God knows when, right? So what is this hollowing out? I mean, is the world being conned in the sense that factually, if it is really true that the US unemployment rate is as low as it is, then why are we rushing around trying to unwind everything in the globalization sort of consensus and so on? I think, you know, if you ask me, the most important thing to do, and fine, we've done this, but I hope that in the World Economic Outlook, which will come out in October, you'll address this. You really need to tell the world, is what is coming out of Washington a lot of nonsense or not? Because I think unless you address this question, you're, as it were, not doing, you're not being fair to the intellectual debate. Now, having said that, let me, having also worked in international organizations, I fully realize this is not easy to do. But you know, there are ways of doing it, and there are ways of sort of raising these issues that would make some people think. So I think that's something we should really concern ourselves with. Now, let's go to the more specific subject which we are discussing here. You know, I think the analysis, as I said, is great fun, and there's lots of data, and I want to look at it more carefully. But I didn't find anything that I would actually object to in the way the data is analyzed. So since people, most of us here are not analysts, they're more like policy wonks. So I thought, well, look, here's this analysis. Let's look at what it says on the policy front. So I want to just go to slide 30. If you want to put that up there, it might be useful. Slide 30, can slide 30 be put up? No?
No, they just...
They can. Okay. Yeah, that's it. So here, I have a series of comments that I want to make. See, the first proposition is simply that, you know, labor productivity in some service sectors is comparable to manufacturing. I don't know if it means all of manufacturing or some service sectors do a lot of manufacturing. I don't find there anything wrong with that. The only difference that I'd like to know about India is that since services in India is also a kind of a residual sump of excess labor, somebody should do some work on whether, you know, in the Indian case, how does productivity, labor productivity in services actually compare with manufacturing? My guess would be that and you know, market and non-market is one quite interesting distinction. And I can believe that non-market services would be a little bit less than manufacturing. They are government services, so they're all really, a lot of the usefulness of those things is in the higher degree of security of jobs and this and that. But that manufacturing actually includes an incredible mix of modern manufacturing with productivity levels, which they tell me very often is quite comparable with that in the rest of the world, and a lot of very small scale, low technology employment. So one needs to know what's happening there. And this is connected, to my mind, with an important point made here, that a lot of the inequality, although I'm downplaying the importance of that for a moment, but a lot of the inequality is really due to within sector differences rather than across sector. Now, you know, analytically, I can see why we look for cross sector, because it's attractive to think of the economy as consisting of two sectors. You know, traditionally, when we used to go to college, which is about 1 million years ago in my case, and you had a two-sector, two-factor economy, usually closed. So most structural change involved going from one sector to another sector. But the fact of the matter is, that's not what an economy is like. And then, of course, very soon, services became very important. Increasingly, I mean, in those days, government services were regarded as inherently unproductive. That's no longer true. You can't simultaneously say that countries like India are seriously lagging behind, which I believe we are, in health and education, and say that employment in these sectors, most of which will be public, is inherently unproductive. So clearly, that's a range of employment that has to increase. And then, of course, the point that Mr. Ranade made, that, you know, I think something about the IPR part, the IT part, the ability to outsource from manufacturing into services has created a hugely productive set of services. And it'd be useful in the Indian context to be able to say, well, how important is this compared to the rest of the service sector? I mean, I don't think I expect the World Economic Outlook to do that, but I hope somebody will look at that in the Indian context. And then, of course, you know, the move to policy priorities. Well, the first one is, and this is basically because you respectabilize services, which is fine, and I have no problem with that. One policy thing is remove barriers to entry and trade in services. Okay. I mean, I would say remove barriers to entry and trade in everything. Ergo services also falls in that category, and I strongly agree with that. But you know, when we talk about trade in services, then you go straight into what are government policies. And all the signals that come out globally are that those do not look very good at all. I'm not sure that that implication is being drawn out in the World Economic Outlook, and I look at the text more carefully for that. Skill development, absolutely clear, we need it. But you know, at least judging now from the Indian example, and this has been, I mean, our policy documents have talked about skill development for the last 10 years, okay? Previous government, present government, etc. The real problem, if you ask me, is that, and I'm speaking now quite objectively, not trying to defend any one government position. I think the real question is, how do you do skill development? Now, in India, you know, if you say you need to do something, I think it roughly takes a bright joint secretary approximately 1 week, less, to come up with a program to promote it, which usually means some government expenditure to finance something or the other under some defined set of rules. And if it's not run by the central government, it's some kind of a shared cost with the state governments. Now, this has been going on for a very long time. And actually, the major message that comes out from these activities is that there is really no evidence that the kind of skilling we are doing is actually leading to the transfer of skills that increase employability. So that's it. Answer has to be India specific. I think we need to think about that. But certainly if there are large countries that have done a better job, I mean, I know Singapore has done a wonderful job, but there are a lot, I mean, Indonesia, I mean, Thailand, Brazil, etc. We need to learn from that. You know, what is it that they're doing about skill development, which we don't seem to be doing? Then, of course, the next one says reforms to boost productivity in all sectors, clearly. The problem really is that, you know, what are the reforms that will boost productivity? That's a open-ended thing. I mean, you know, you can have a whole seminar on that. But I read this dominantly as saying that please don't be afraid of productivity improvement. In other words, that your employment strategy should not consist of saying, let's hold back productivity increases. Many people, by the way, in India, when they discuss this, are concerned about this aspect because they say, yes, you know, you're going to increase productivity, but that means you're going to reduce employment. So we need to go into, are we very clear about that? And how do you respond to the usual argument of people that, look, I mean, all this productivity increase is only reducing, you know, this is the fixed lump of labor kind of view on employment, but it still exists in many people's minds. Okay? I've talked about this displacement business because that's the essence of a lot of the problems. But you know, you need to address the issue that, of course, in the West, you need to address the issue, is displacement being caused by trade or by changes in technology? And what I've read suggests that there's overwhelming evidence that is not caused by trade. And frankly, in the international documentation that's put out, I don't find that adequately reflected. Because, I mean, if you're having an international debate, I mean, if this is truly a finding, this should be put forward much more broadly. I agree that those who object to this in any case would say that, look, something that disrupts workforces needs to be reacted to. I mean, you know, social safety net, maybe reskilling, whatever it is. And that, of course, is something, the specifics will vary across countries. But that, I mean, that's a right way of addressing the question that, yes, there's displacement taking place in the West and in India, and what do we do about it? You know, in India, and I'll finish in, I know the organizers are getting very nervous, so finish very quickly. I think it's really true that we ourselves are in two minds. I mean, on the one hand, we want the conversion of more and more informal sector employment into more organized formal employment. I think that's clearly the right thing to do. But implicit in that is the fact that because of higher productivity, that there will be some displacement of jobs, and that this can be offset only if you have a large and a high enough growth rate. But we know there are constraints on the growth rate, and when if we are growing at 7.5%, it's not likely that we can do that much better. So what does that mean? You know, it's very difficult to think of compensating for displacements when you're referring to a very large number of people. I mean, the big difference between unemployment in the West and, let's say, low quality employment in India is that the numbers in the West are manageable. The numbers in India are not only not manageable, but there's no way of verifying them. I mean, any number of people could continue to work in the informal sector and say, I've been displaced. So I think some of the sort of social push for just policies can lead to experimenting in forms whose principal objective will be to drive the system fiscally bankrupt in a relatively short period of time. And I think this is something that we need to discuss amongst our own NGOs, because they are frequently a very powerful force for bringing in more and more of the social justice measures, generally with little concern about what that might do, especially since none of these is ever done as a substitution. I mean, for example, I think the Economic Survey put out the universal basic income. I've heard lots of people saying, if only you get rid of A, B, and C, you can have a universal basic. Absolutely true. But if the probability is that you will have A, B, and C and a universal basic income, what exactly is your view on that? So I think we need to clarify some of these things. But having said that, Bertrand, I really enjoyed your presentation, and also I recommend strongly that we read the WEO. Thank you.